So JG, when the Canadian real estate market isn't happy, there ain't nobody happy, and we got the data and the charts to show it.
Patrick, I don't know what they're unhappy about. I mean, residential prices in most provinces has actually gone up, not down, and in some cases, it's gone up quite a bit. So what are they unhappy about?
It's not all about prices, JG. Let's talk about it. Listen, folks, we're growing this channel. We're actually getting some momentum. We need more likes. Please like the show. Subscribe. Give us some comments. Let us know what we're doing right or wrong. Give us your feedback. Why aren't people happy about real estate?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode number 58, Patrick. And if you look where we started, episode number 1 and where the real estate market was to episode number 58, let me tell you, it is different. And I think we should start the show by talking about this unhappiness that is kind of throughout the market. And in fact, CD Howe Institute just published a study that has dropped Canada from the 5th happiest to the 15th happiest. That's quite a bit of a drop, isn't it, Patrick?
It is. You know, what's interesting about this particular slide is Stephanie and I just dropped a podcast on our Mindset Matters podcast, which speaks to what people are facing, and that if they're not seeing a future, if they're not able to say, okay, well, today I'm here and in the future I see myself there, happiness levels drop dramatically. And when we look at this particular cohort, when you look at that age group of unhappiness, guess what? It correlates with the fact that affordability on housing, people being able to have that home, that white picket fence, that 3 bedrooms or whatever it might be of their dream, and the lack of affordability, you see that younger cohort really struggling, and they're just not happy. And so they've got nothing to look forward to in the housing market. And we can actually see on the next chart that we'll show, which is, you know, the prices as they've increased, we've seen happiness levels drop.
Now, interesting, Patrick. So here's how I define happiness. I'll just give you my own personal kind of definition. And this is a mentor, 25 years ago, gave me this definition. I've used it ever since. So for me, happiness is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. That's what yields to happiness, is like a progressive realization of a worthy ideal. So something that you believe is a worthy ideal and you're progressing. So progress equals happiness. And I think, Patrick, this is why we've dropped, because a lot of people are not feeling they're making progress, because inflation as one of the major issues that we've just gone through, and we're not done with it yet, that robs people of that feeling of progress. They go to the store, and you got this great chart, which I want to show in a second, but you go to the store and like the money you put on the counter just buys a whole lot less than it did. And that is essentially the opposite of progress. And you're right, that all kind of shows up in unhappiness, if you will. I mean, I'm happier than ever, Patrick, but I'm not the average,
Well, no, you're not the average, as a matter of fact. And, you make a really great point, JG, which is it's the progress. It's knowing that you're gaining ground. And people are unhappy right now, especially the younger cohort, because they don't feel like they're gaining ground. So you didn't say we achieve a worthy goal and we're happy. No, it is the progressive steps that we take towards that goal and the future that we see that we can achieve it. And right now, people aren't seeing that as being achievable. So they feel like they're not making any progress. And as a matter of fact, they take 2 steps forward or a step forward and take 2 steps back. That's what's going on in the world today. Because you actually look at that happiness chart and, look at the 60-year-old and above, it's actually the happiness levels are ticking up. And why is that? Well, I happen to be the senior citizen in the room right now. And I know, and I mean, let's face it, I've gotten wealthier because I own assets. I own real estate. So I don't have that same pressure as the younger cohort that is really struggling to make those gains. So the average 60 plus, year old has gained because they own these assets. They are ahead of the game in that regard. And we can see that, well, guess what? It makes you a little happier because you're progressively moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Patrick. And this chart, even though, we believe in, and you brought this up, and I think it's very fascinating, is, correlation is not necessarily causation, right? And so we're not necessarily saying that that this chart is the cause of the unhappiness, but it's definitely correlated, which is interesting. But look at the precipitous drop, Patrick, in first-time home buyers. I mean, this has fallen off a cliff. Now, this chart is as of October 2021, and I can't wait for them to publish again in 2025, hopefully, because I'm very curious to see where we think this is going to go. Because I mean, Patrick, we believe that first-time homebuyers are even lower than they were, and look at that. I mean, it's literally falling off a cliff here.
Yeah, it's not rocket science. We know it's gotten significantly worse. How much worse can it get? I mean, it's dropped, dramatically. And, that speaks to number one, the affordability issue, the lack of confidence, consumer confidence issue, the difficulty in getting financing because the banks have tightened up. There's no good news for first time homebuyers.
Yeah. Now, I want to, before we move on to the next topic, Patrick, I thought this image was super fascinating when I seen this, because it really shows kind of the difference between 1947 and today. And of course, we've all heard the stories from our grandparents where, for $1 we used to buy a case of beer and a loaf of bread and a bologna and a this and a that, and all these various things. This is fascinating, Patrick. This is $12.50 and what it bought a family of groceries, which in this case seemed to last a family of four, including a cat. Let's call it a family of five if you include the cat. This would last them a week, and that $12.50 then is worth $166 today. Can you still buy this amount of food for $166, Patrick? What do you think?
Well, something is interesting that you asked that question, because let's move on to the gold conversation. So I want to just share, when I was a young man and my parents, four kids, we'd go to the grocery store, and it would take four kids multiple trips from the car to the house with bags, those paper bags full of groceries. And I don't know, and I don't recall what the amount my parents spent, but if you listen to them, it wasn't a lot of money, relatively speaking, but we made multiple trips from the car to the house to unload these groceries, feeding a family of six plus a couple of dogs, right? We joke about that. But, when we look at what we refer to today as the canary in the gold mine, which is gold and the price of gold. So I want to share a quick story before we get into it. And this is about gold, by the way. So let's just give a scenario where we own hard assets and we think that we're gaining net worth by doing that. But there's another side to that story, which people have a difficult time wrapping their mind around, which is it's actually the devaluation of our dollar. So gold is the only real money. Now, back to your question, can we buy $166 worth of groceries and have that much? Like, what is it? I can't remember the exact question, but the point is if you had gold in your pocket, you'd actually be doing that if you had bought gold and held on to it. So let me share this story with you. So let's just take the scenario. Your grandparents, or perhaps your great grandparents, back in 1925, 1930, they immigrated into Canada and they get married and they start to work and planning for a family, and they start to have a family. Gold back at that time was $30 an ounce. And your grandfather worked really hard and he's able to save up $30. Now, $30 was a lot of money. He was probably making 25 cents, 50 cents an hour, somewhere in that neighborhood. But he saved up and he bought that ounce of gold. And he said to your grandmother, he said, I'm going to put this in our chest and this is going to be part of our legacy. We're going to give this to our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren. She goes, that's a great idea. And so they did that. And then he continued to work really hard and he actually bought a house and paid for it. And he paid the astronomical amount of money, $7,500 for that house in the Toronto area. And he paid for it and he took the title of that house and he said, something, sweetheart, I'm going to put this and we're going to give this to the kids. And it's going to go to our grandkids and our great grandkids. And she goes, that's a great idea. And he continued to work hard. And actually, he saved $20 and he put an extra $20. He says, something? I'm going to put this cash in that little box with our gold and our title. This is for our grandchildren. And so now come ahead and you're that grandchild or that great grandchild. And you open up this little box. And inside that box is an ounce of gold. Well, back when your grandfather bought that $30 ounce of gold, it was known, and the reputation for an ounce of gold is it will buy you a fine suit, a wonderful meal, and a fantastic hotel room. Now, forge ahead. This many years later, you open up that box, there's that ounce of gold. JG, today, an ounce of gold is about $4,100 Canadian. It will buy you a great suit, a wonderful meal, and certainly a room in a hotel. Now, the title of that house, you look at it, $7,500 in Toronto. That house today is worth $720,000 average price. And you go, wow. And then you grab that $20 bill and you say, well, if we top it off, we can buy a couple of coffees at Starbucks. The point of this story is that our fiat currency, our cash, continues to lose value. Hard assets such as gold, real money, such as real estate, actually, we think it's appreciating. It's really the devaluation of our dollar, which is only to say that we need to get our capital into hard assets. So I share this story often to give people a context for it. And here's what we need to know. JG, you and I have said this many times. It's a common phrase, follow the money. And where is the money of the wealthiest people moving?
No, I think you're absolutely bang on, Patrick, in terms of this looking at it from a gold perspective changes everything, doesn't it? I mean, it's a different lens to look through, and it changes everything. And I actually did some rough math while you were illustrating that story, and 34. So you're right. Back in 1947, what I'll give U.S. prices just to eliminate the conversion of Canadian, but a 1 ounce in 1947, 1 ounce of gold was $34. That $34 today in dollars is worth $485. That's what $34 then is worth today. But 1 ounce of gold today is $2,900 US, 4,100 Canadian, and that's the difference. That's a 7 times difference, Patrick. That's 700% different. That's a massive deal, isn't it?
Well, it is. And so when you look at house prices today, and you've got the chart there that we did in terms of what it would, if you look at buying a house in gold, I don't know what year we had, but where is that? So that's back in 2000. So average price of a house was 165,000, took you 300 and what is that, 97 ounces of gold to buy a $165,000 house. Today, average price is $720,000 roughly, and it takes you 173 ounces of gold to buy that house. So house prices have gone up, but it takes less gold. That's because our dollar is being devalued. I cannot stress that enough. And when you look at gold as a canary in the coal mine, it's where money seeks safety. So central banks around the world are buying gold in tonnage, record amounts, and have been really since 2019, but have cranked it up to astronomical levels literally in the past year. So central banks are nervous. The wealthiest individuals in our country, in the world, are going to gold. Now, they're also going to real estate, by the way. I can't stress enough, as much as we think our assets are elevating and how do we get into the real estate market? It's too expensive when we can't do cash flow. I get all of that, by the way, but it's up to us to get our capital to work. Real estate's fantastic for that because we can leverage our capital. It's much harder, and so people are kicking off to the sidelines, but they are going to pay a price of that for that over the years as our dollars continue to devalue, JG. And if you've got money in the bank today, just know that its buying power in a year from now will be as much as 15% less than it is today. And so I can't stress enough, we need to get our capital to work. And of course, real estate is one of those things.
Now, Patrick, I just love this lens because when you put on a different set of glasses like this, you see things differently. And when you see things differently, you get to ask new questions. And I think this is a very fascinating way to look at it. And you're absolutely right. And I think this is what you've been talking about for some time. A lot of real estate experts that are not necessarily just trying to sell real estate. And that's the biggest thing, Patrick, with the Real Estate Investment Network and the things we've done. Like, we're not interested in selling real estate. We're not trying to sell real estate here. We're just trying to educate based on like the realities of the real estate market. And this is a different lens for people to see the real estate market through. Now, speaking of the housing market, Patrick, quite a bit of things are bad. I mean, listen, is there any good news? Let's just be honest, Patrick. Is there any good news?
No, there's absolutely no good news. There's none. It's like I've been looking for some, but I can't find any.
Now, let's talk about. I want to talk about delinquencies because we're starting to see some like these mortgage arrears have jumped up. We're starting to see insolvencies goes up. We knew this would happen in 2025, Patrick, because a lot of mortgages were set to renew in 2025 and 2026. We knew that would kind of be the crux of it, that late 2024 into 2025. Is that why this is happening now, or is it just working its way through the system?
Well, there's a number of things. There is certainly a slowdown in the economy. And this is where, if you really unpack the numbers, we're actually seeing unemployment increase, although the numbers show that, oh, we got all these new jobs. But you have to lift the hood on those numbers to realize what makes those numbers up. So, as much as it looks like unemployment has actually dropped a little, when you look at hours worked, and I don't have a chart for it, but when you look at the number of hours worked, it's less. So, the point of all of this is that when we look at what's happening economically. So, aside from the housing market, we have to look at what's unfolding economically. And unemployment is rising. And when we look at a housing market that is basically shutting down and has shut down dramatically, we see construction jobs that are really starting to escalate in terms of the unemployment in a specific industry. We're seeing consumers are buying less. We've talked about this at nauseum in terms of productivity of Canada. We are not productive. Our government has hired a bureaucracy of people that inflates, or it seems to look like our unemployment is lower, but it's really government jobs. So we think we live in a democracy. The reality of it is we live in a bureaucracy. And then on top of it, we've cut back the immigration numbers dramatically. So we're not floating the Canadian economic boat on the immigration, which we did for the past 5 years when they opened up the gates and people coming in and consuming and buying real estate and all the things that new immigrants into the country do. So all of that is really, for all intent and purpose, shut down dramatically, which then affects things like rents are dropping. Housing is now, we've got buyers that aren't buying, and then people listing can't sell their house. So, and by the way, just as a side note in all this confusing conversation, is the reality that we're seeing listings spike, but buyers are not coming out to buy. So it's a whole different challenge that we face.
Yeah, the deals out there are incredible, Patrick. We've done a couple deals in the last couple weeks, and wow, like really great deals. Tons of flexibility. I can't remember a time when we were so flexible. I actually wrote a condition in an offer yesterday that I have never written before, and it was like, and it's just like, yeah, no problem. We got time. Yeah, let's work together. Let's figure this out. And I'm just like, wow, gone are the days 2 years ago when you were written offers, blind. You had no idea what was going on. It's just a totally different market right now. And for those that are acquiring, definitely some great opportunities out there. But most are not, as you said, Patrick. Most are sitting on their hands. They're sitting on their wallet, and it is not great out there.
Well, fear keeps people on the sidelines for sure, and you can't even be critical of it. But when you look at this, this particular headline, mortgage payments and people going into arrears, interesting, isn't it, that individuals are going into arrears, yet mortgage rates have been quite high for some time. They're actually coming down. So what is all of this whole, why are insolvencies going up? Why are people, claiming bankruptcy, and why is that starting to trend upwards? And the ultimate reason for that is because people aren't working like our numbers would indicate they are. Unemployment is in fact going up, and as soon as you see that unemployment rise, you're going to in fact see these insolvencies and bankruptcies start to increase, and that's really what's going on in behind the scenes. And again, there's no good news in any of what's happening right now. And then on top of it, we've got the tariff threat, we've got the lack of government, and who's leading this country, we don't know. Trudeau quit, but he didn't quit. They don't have a new liberal leader. Are we going to a election, or are we not going to election? All of this keeps people really frightened and sitting on the sidelines, and they're just wait and see. Now, you can't even be critical of it, but for us, because of our experience and because of what we see opportunities and continue to see opportunities in real estate, but it is heavy lifting, no question about it.
Well, this is where the reps come in. This is the work. You're not going to get in shape without doing the reps. And this is the time to be doing your reps. That's the reality of this market. I was talking to another investor, a friend of ours, Patrick Dominic, who I believe is speaking at their RAIN member meeting tonight, which I know he's got a great talk lined up. But Dominic and I were talking, and he's just like, he is just crazy, crazy, crazy busy right now. And he was like, we were talking about how it's funny when the market creates chaos the way it has in the last little bit, how much opportunity it truly creates. And even though it is a mind shift for people, this is when the deals are, this is when the opportunities are. And I agree, you said some a while ago, Patrick, that I thought was interesting. You said we can't blame people, and I agree, we can't blame people. But what I don't want to hear, and I'm saying it here so it's on record, is I don't want to hear anyone bitching and complaining and moaning when the price of real estate goes back up and values come way back up, and people start saying, I can't find cash flow, I can't find a good deal, I can't find anything that pencils. I don't want to hear any of this shit from anybody, because this was the moment, this was the opportunity, and we told them. So it's up to them to jump on it. Is it easy? No, but this is the time.
Well, yeah, and you make a really good point. Of course, it just goes back to what we shared many times, is how much emotion drives people's buying patterns. So when, we're in a boom cycle, everybody on paper is getting rich, everybody is lining up to buy deals and drive the price up. Yet when it's a down market like we're feeling right now, this is when the market should be really, I guess, busy, yet you see the odd individual like a Dominic, as we use, but it's not a crowded space. So there's lots of time to look for deals. There's lots of time to find deals. There's lots of negotiation room. And yet there's not a lot of players in the game right now because it seems so scary. That's an emotion driven scenario that we find ourselves in. And a lot of the investors are going to lose out in the opportunity because they're not willing to grind it out to look for those deals, to get the financing. And there is a price that they will pay on the other side of that, which is they're not going to see their net worth increase. They're not going to see the maintaining value of their dollars. And that'll start to show its head in 3 to 5 years. You have to look into the future in real estate, of course. But I want to share a couple of things. Is that there's some interesting headwinds that, for example, what's happening in British Columbia and Ontario. Now, Ontario is definitely in the tank, and these tariffs are going to kick the shit out of Ontario if they go through the way they're being presented. I think there's a lot of drama around the tariffs, and I'm not saying, I don't want to discount it, but there's just so much drama around it, and really Trump's a pretty good negotiator. I think he's talking 25% this, 100% that. Then he said, "Oh, what we're going to do is we're going to match the tariffs of all of the countries that put tariffs on goods into the U.S." So he says, "We're just going to match those tariffs." Well, I don't know if you saw the report, but there's a number of items that Canada has put tariffs on into the US, and some of them are like 150, 300%, like big numbers. So again, Trump's just being a negotiator ultimately, but it's a lot of drama and a lot of distraction called the tariffs. And that's also some of the things that are freaking people out. What's going to happen in Ontario is that that economy is going to really get hurt. Having said that, that'll ripple out across the country. But here's what's happening in BC in housing, just to give you an example. So in British Columbia, JG, you in new builds now, you cannot put natural gas. You have to be hydro. So this is a broad statement, and I'm not going to get into the motion. No, true. Okay, so
No.
Yes. So you do a development in
Is
BC.
this your NDP government at work right there?
Yeah,
Is that what this is?
this is. I think this is EB at work. Okay, so listen to this. This is like ludicrous. So you put it. Let's say you're going to build a fourplex. You're going to build a fourplex in Vancouver. You cannot put that building on natural gas. It has to be hydro. Now, on top of that, so for example, you're going to put, I don't know, you're going to put a 600 amp service into that fourplex, just round numbers, maybe it's a 500 amp, whatever it is. You have to put a pad mounted transformer in the yard. And by the way, JG, you have to give that a 12 by 12 space, because of course then put the bars around it so people don't run into it, all the stories that go with that. Now what's interesting about that, so this is so ridiculous, so you have to bring in hydro. Guess where they get the hydro from? The
The
US.
States, most likely. Of course.
From the US, right into this whole tariff drama that we got going on, number one. Number two is guess where and guess how the US generates that power? Coal. So we're buying dirty electricity from the US because we don't have the power grid to drive it. And, so we're plugging our, of course, in BC, you're hug a tree. So you're plugging in your EV because you're
To
going to
be
save the
powered by coal. It's a coal-powered EV.
It's a coal-powered EV. I mean, how ridiculous does it get? So those are the kinds of things that are going on in British Columbia, and we all know what they did in terms of short-term rentals. I mean, Airbnb, like it's just become like, how do we?
But
Go ahead.
listen, Patrick, until Trump got in, the height of stupidity on the south of the border, right? Or earlier, like not, I was gonna say earlier this year, but late last year, if you will, middle of last year, the stupidity was at its height back then. And that's where we are right now. We're about to go through a change of government, but let me tell you, they're going to cram all kinds of stupid shit through that they can right up until the moment because they know they won't be able to do that into the future. That's what I think, anyways.
Well, I think it's going to, yeah, I think that pattern's going to play out and we're going to see it and then it's going to be a big change. But ultimately, we have to try and remain optimistic about what's going on in Canada politically and some of the decisions that they're going to make.
Before we move on, Patrick, let's back it up to the tariffs for a second. Listen, you run a very successful retail business, and if there's anyone the tariffs are going to impact, it's going to be you. So let me ask you, what are you doing about it? Because I've been asking business owners, small, big, medium-sized business owners, what they're doing about the tariffs. I'm getting a variety of answers. But let me just ask you, PF. I mean, what are you doing right now with regards to the tariffs, and what's coming down the line from your various suppliers? Which, by the way, a ton of that stuff comes from the U.S. and from around the world. But what's happening? Tell me what you're seeing.
Okay, well, that's an interesting question, and glad you asked it. But what's funny about our particular industry is about 95% of the stuff that we're buying, we're buying from suppliers in Canada, but their goods are produced, guess where? In China, not the US. So there's very little of what we're selling is coming from the US or even made locally, as in Canada. No surprise there. But ultimately, we're not really at the effects of tariffs directly. There's some items, and we'll stock up on those particular items, maybe hedge our bet. But I think the tariffs are going to come in far lower. I think the big concern is on steel. And this goes back to the fear of housing prices dropping. So let's talk about housing prices and the fear that there's a bubble and it's going to, housing prices are going to drop. So we're going to take condos out of this conversation. We keep going back to it, but it just skews numbers. And we know that the condo market is melting down in both Vancouver and Toronto to the degree that it is. Let's just take that out of the conversation. But the steel, there's a lot of steel goes into housing, JG. And
yeah, tons.
Okay, well, what do you think that's going to do to housing prices, by the way? Do you think that's going to get absorbed by the end user? Yes.
No. It was. Sorry, I thought you meant it's going to be absorbed by the construction, by the builder. And I said no, because it won't. It'll get passed on to the consumer.
100%. So, when we look at even having the conversation again about the importance of getting your capital to work in real estate being that, prices in housing, man, oh man, I just can't see it coming off. It may chop sideways for a while, but when we start to look at this thing called tariffs, just as one example, we're going to see housing prices rise because those numbers are going to get passed on. So we need to hedge again, put our capital to work. So I think we're going to be at the effect of all of that.
Well, 100%, Patrick. And actually, we're going to come back to residential prices in just a sec here because some data has come out for where the prices have gone from January this year to January last year. So, a lot of people, and that's the thing, they're reading headlines, they're making a ton of assumptions. The average person, even if they are an investor and they own one or two or three properties, they often aren't in the real estate business quite as much as you and I, Patrick. So they're making a ton of assumptions. They're assuming where the price is going based on stories they hear, based on their neighbors, so on and so forth. But what has actually happened to the prices in the last year, Patrick? As you can see from this chart, just about every province other than Manitoba and BC are up. Some are up significantly. Ontario is not up nearly as much as it is, but it's still up 1%, Patrick. This isn't down 5 or 10 or 12 or 15% like people expect. It's still up 1% in Ontario. BC's down, a little less than 1%. Manitoba is essentially nil, but Alberta's up, Saskatchewan's up, Quebec is up. That one was surprising to me. New Brunswick is way up, even though I find they got a really low they have a much smaller denominator to grow off of. But still, the average person, if they look at this chart, are going to say, I didn't think this was going to happen. I didn't think this is where the real estate market was going to be. Even with all the challenges, this is the reality. These are the numbers.
Yeah, and if you were to take if you take the condo market out of there, those price increases have been dramatically higher because we've always said, condos are not that's pre-construction. So let's just talk about detached and realizing that detached prices have gone up in many regions, and there's exceptions to all of these rules. By the way, the point is that pricing on housing has not come down. I don't see it coming down in that detached space. And I think that's really driven by just the cost of doing business. The cost of inflation will continue and house prices will increase in real terms.
Yeah, the tariffs, there's no doubt the tariffs, and we talked about this in the last show, but I just want to recap kind of the three major elements of these tariffs and what's going to happen. If it was just about the tariffs, that would drive prices of real estate up for sure. 100% construction prices are going to go up. Therefore, that's going to get passed on. But the thing is that we have to fight against is that the tariffs will lead to an economic slowdown. That economic slowdown will put the Bank of Canada in a horrible place, which is low productivity, high pricing, inflation. And as a result, they're going to have to make a choice. Which one do we lean against? And the Bank of Canada's mandate is to keep pricing stable. As a result, they're going to lean on bringing the inflation down, not productivity. Therefore, they won't lower rates as much as they should in order to get that pricing down. That's a tough spot to be in, Patrick, and I really hope we don't get there because it's a really, really hard balance to strike.
Well, JG, if you recall, 2 years ago, I'm saying, and I said on more than one occasion, that we are at a risk of entering into a world of stagflation. And I think that is very real. Even just what you said is a description of stagflation, and that's what we're bumping against. But I want to finally, as we wind down here, I want to bring one story to the table that is being talked about. We'll shine a bigger light on it right now, which is what's happening in terms of what recently RBC has done in terms of financing the meltdown of the Toronto, Vancouver condo market. And that is this. What, of course, was happening, a lot of pre-construction, people were paying 1.2 million as an example for a pre-construction condo. Now they come to fruition. It's time to step up, get financing, take position. And what have we got going on? Well, that $1.2 million condo is now $800,000. Rents were X, now they're Y, much lower. And so when you go to get financing, you bought it for 1.2, counting on financing of 1.2, it's 800,000. You got to cover that spread. Now, I can understand why RBC is doing this, but what they're doing is they're doing what is called a blanket appraisal. So they're literally looking at and not going out and they're going to old appraisals, the blanket appraisal, saying, oh no, it's worth 1.2 million. And they're actually providing financing on that 1.2 million. Now they got the reason to do that, of course, is that they probably also have financing on the building from the builder. And if they let those prices go, if they do not finance, if people start to foreclose, which is already happening, they stand to lose a lot of money. So they're going to lend against 1.2 million, not the 800,000. That's the game that RBC started, and other banks are stepping into it, by the way. They are protecting their downside, but what does that do? It protects the downside of the housing price as well. So it's a real messy situation that's going on in this country overall, especially in that condo market.
I find it, I really want to dig into this, and hopefully one of our viewers knows more about this, Patrick, but I agree this makes sense for RBC to do this if they're financing the developer. Say the developer has finance with RBC, and by the way, oftentimes that's what happens. The bank or the lending institution that is financing the development will often facilitate the exit because they're essentially facilitating their own exit, and they make money all along the way. And the fees are astronomical, by the way. They're just nuts. But this is how they make a shit ton of money. So it would make sense for RBC to say, listen, we can't exit this developer. We are going to be held, we're going to be left holding both sides of that bag if we don't do something. So it makes sense for them to do it if they have financed the development. I don't see it as making a whole lot of sense though, Patrick, if they didn't do the development. I mean, I just want to find out, like, are they doing this for anybody and everything? I just find this kind of fascinating.
I think it's probably conditional. It probably isn't everybody. I think they're looking at it, but they're protecting their downside. I mean, we know that OSFI came in and they had all banks had to up their reserve on the downside of mortgages that they were carrying because a lot of the banks are very exposed in their portfolio of mortgages that they hold. So the downside is big. And if they don't finance this and there's more powers of sale that are going up and we start to see more delinquencies and more insolvencies, I mean, technically, I guess, I mean, theoretically and beyond theoretical, we could have a literal bank meltdown. Not likely to happen in Canada, but it's a possibility. And I think everybody's just protecting their downside as we go forward in this really uncertain time economically. And it's hard to be optimistic about what's happening in Canada economically. It just is. You know, at the end of the day, when you unpack the unemployment numbers, we're seeing unemployment going up, not down as advertised. And this is all a concern. If people aren't working, they're not spending money, the cost of living is getting higher, the cost of rent, the cost of food, the cost of gas. I mean, people just don't have the disposable income. And that shuts down the consumerism, which is a big part of our economy.
Yeah, 100%, Patrick. And I did a bit more research on this while we've been going back and forth, and it looks like RBC is offering that blanket appraisal program, primarily for deals that they did the development on. And I get it now because they need to exit them. They're essentially got to exit themselves out of their own deal, and the only way they're going to do that is by doing these blanket appraisals. Kind of interesting. And I think you mentioned, I think earlier in the show, maybe even off air, where there's a bit of a loophole here because this is not something like, listen, if the average Joe went into the bank and said, I bought this thing for 1.2, it's only worth 800 now. Can you finance me on 1.2? There's no way on earth they would do that for anybody else. Interesting though, they do it for themselves. Fascinating.
Well, it would be interesting to know. So, for example, if I bought that building or if I bought that particular unit for 1.2, I was at risk of only having, the value of it at 800,000, having to deal with financing, but I got full financing on it because RBC is covering their ass. Ultimately though, what am I doing? There's a profit there. Am I going to pull it off the table? What are people going to do with that
No,
finance?
I bet you they won't let you. They'd be writing that into the deal.
I have no idea, but you start to, yeah, these are the kind of the details. It's still a relatively new thing that's coming out. So as we learn more about it, we'll share it with our listeners.
It is very, very interesting, Patrick, and I'm sure there's some specs on it that are quite unique. But I bet you in the end, it's actually quite smart for RBC to do this, like for themselves. Like looking at it, if I was the CEO of RBC, it's kind of an interesting way to do it, and it's an interesting way to protect yourself. And in fact, I bet you that if you look into these things, Patrick, they probably kicked out amortization on these deals down the line too. They're probably doing 35, 40-year amortizations on them. And you know how much money those banks make on that extra 10 years or 15 years of amort? It's just crazy.
Banks aren't dumb, but you're absolutely, and that, by the way, is a great point because that is, in fact, exactly what's going on.
Well, Patrick, even though this was an incredibly depressing episode with no good news and a bunch of unhappiness, I, for one, am happy. You know why? Because I am progressing on my goals. And I think you said something interesting there at the beginning of the episode, which is, happiness isn't about achieving those goals necessarily. It's about progressing towards those goals. And, that is something that's in everyone's control, Patrick, is they can progress on their own goals. So yes, sometimes real estate's going to go sideways. And yes, sometimes you're not going to have, the best news in the world, but you can still make progress towards your goals. So I'm getting out of here, Patrick, and I'm going to make progress on my goals.
Well, I think it's a great point. And yes, if you stay engaged, keep looking into the future, don't sit on the sidelines, little steps making progress. It's one step at a time. You'll be much happier when you look back and go, holy cow, have I ever come a long ways? But it is one step at a time. Keep grinding. In spite of the headwinds we face, lean into them, keep moving. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more of what JG and I have got, check out our last episode. It was epic.